Hey, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now, I applaud you because you've read the podcast title and it says inflation, but yet here you are. You know what? You're going to be rewarded because the stuff we're going to run through in this episode is going to blow your mind.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday property investors come to be informed and inspired. We've been banging on about inflation for years on this podcast, and finally, we've got company. Everyone's talking about inflation at the moment. Inflation is here. Things are visibly getting more expensive from month to month. But why is it happening? Will it last? And what is the government going to do about it? We're going to be answering all those questions in this episode, so don't go anywhere. Our news story this week comes from a piece of research from the National Residential Landlords Association. We'll link to it in the show notes. And they've calculated how many different pieces of law there are that affect people who rent out property in England. And the answer, do you want to have a guess? The answer is 168. There are 168 separate pieces of legislation, and that number has increased by 40% in the last decade, which is absolutely massive. We knew it had gone up because every few weeks we seem to be talking about something new that's on the horizon. But 40% in a decade, that's a whole lot of law to comply with. And to make things worse, they've also found out that in the last year that they have data for, 89% of local authorities did not issue a single civil penalty relating to property. So there's all this law, local authorities have the job of enforcing it, and they're not doing it, basically. So the argument that they're making is not that we need new laws, which always seems to be the knee-jerk response, but actually we need to make it easier for local authorities to enforce the laws that actually exist, because you've got a situation where the vast majority of property owners are doing their best to comply with all these 168 different things, but you've all got a small minority who are making no effort to do so, and really putting tenants at risk, and there's not a lot being done about it. So that's a really interesting piece that we'll link to. We've also got a secondary news story. This one's from Estate Agent Today. It says, mortgage bonanza as choice grows and rates tumble. This is something we've reported on before, but it's a trend that continues. So it's worth making you aware that the mortgage market is still getting better. There are now 4,500 property products in the market, which is only slightly down on where they were before the pandemic started. So when the pandemic kicked off, lots of lenders pulled all their products, reduced their choice, and mortgages became a lot harder to come by and more expensive for investors. But now, for the last 9 months, the number of products has been increasing and rates are coming down. So the average 2-year fix is now 2.55%. So good news for investors there. Now, just before we get onto our main topic this week, we've got a new way for you to keep up with what we've got going on. So over the second half of the year, we've got an absolute ton of stuff planned. And maybe you don't really care about that. You just want to come for the info on the podcast. That's absolutely fine. But if you do want to know what we've got going on, and it's pretty exciting, then we've got a way for you to find out first what it is that we've got planned. All you've got to do is send the word first to 88802. So send a text to the number 88802 with the word first, and that's it. And once you've done that, you will be the first in the know about everything that we've got coming up for the rest of the year. And let me just say, there will be the odd little bonus, the odd little advantage to being the first in the know. So just send first to 88802. Depending on your phone or your network, it might send you a warning about the fact that it's charging you for that text. Don't worry, it'll only charge you for one regular text message at whatever rate you normally pay for any other text. That's it. It's just a warning to protect you. But send that word first to 88802 and you will be the first in the know.
So, Rob, if you started a conversation about inflation with most people, you'll see their eyes glaze over. But yet, here we are again, talking about inflation and going into more depth than ever before. In fact, we've got a juicy two-parter. But we don't apologise for it because it's so important to understand. It literally could be the difference between you being wealthy when you are older or poorer. Whatever age you're listening to this, if you don't really understand it and then understand what you can do about it, then you're going to be punished. You're going to be really punished, actually. You're set up by inflation to become poorer. So why are we talking about it again? Because it's so important, isn't it?
Despite the negative social cues that I get when I try to talk about inflation, I will not apologise and I will not stop talking about inflation because it is as important as you say. If you think about it as a long-term mechanism that is guaranteed to wipe out your wealth if you don't do something about it, maybe that's enough of a motivation to listen. It is super, super important. It's critical for property investors to understand. We've covered it on the podcast a couple of times in the past, but we're covering it again for a couple of reasons. One is that it is that important. You can't just mention it once and leave it at that. But the other reason is that we're no longer the only ones talking about inflation. Inflation is a bit of a hot topic at the moment. As a result of what's happened over the last couple of years, talk of inflation is in the air. People think inflation may be coming, having not seen a lot of it for a long time. So if you're starting to see some of this chatter and you don't really get what it's all about or what anyone's talking about, then don't worry, you don't have to sit there and be too embarrassed to ask. We've got you covered in this episode, because I don't know if I should say this because there might be people turning off en masse, but we're going to go into inflation in some depth.
But before we do, it was interesting. I was speaking to one of our lovely many podcast listeners recently, Colin, hello to you. And he summarised this in a really nice way. And it was that if you save money, you're guaranteed to be poorer. And obviously it's true because of inflation. And we understand it on a conceptual level. And many people listening to this, if you've been listening for a while, will understand that. But then stop for a moment and think, how do you generally feel about saving? Before I'd say that, do you think it's a positive thing or a negative thing? If you ask that question to the majority of the nation, their answer will be positive. But yet, if you save and leave it at that, because of inflation, you're going to end up poorer in the long term. So that financial guidance that we've all been given as children and then growing up and beyond to make sure you save will only make you poorer. Now, if that doesn't motivate you to understand this in more detail, then nothing will. Because let's face it, you don't listen to the property podcast to become poorer. I'm sure the majority of people who listen to the property podcast are doing so because they want to change their lives for the better, using property as the vehicle to do that. We will sometimes stray away from property because there are also other things at play that will make you a lot poorer. But also, inflation can really exaggerate the effects of property in a very positive way. So that's why it's so important. And that's why it's got to be a two-parter. But by the end of these two parts, you're going to feel pretty smug and also pretty shocked, I think, because when you really, really get your head around this, your mind's blown. It's almost like a new world of looking at things, and you can't believe what everyone else is doing and why they're doing it that way. But it's because it's what we've been taught. So let's get into it. What is inflation? Well, that's interesting because you can keep it quite simple and talk about inflation on a very high level, but you can actually break inflation down into three different types. Rob, we've got consumer price inflation, asset price inflation, and monetary inflation. So let's start with consumer price inflation. What is it?
Well, that's the one that you're most familiar with. So when you see inflation numbers reported in the media, they're almost always talking about consumer prices, and it's measured with something called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. And that's calculated by taking the prices of a whole load of goods that they think are typical goods that people buy on a regular basis, figuring out the price of those compared to what that price was last month or last year or whatever time period they're looking at. And the change in those average prices is taken to be the rate of inflation. So consumer price inflation is kind of like your default inflation, and the upshot of it is that the pound in your pocket buys less every year. As time passes, the goods and services that you need and that you want become more expensive. So you need to earn more to be able to buy the same. That's what inflation is. But although that's the type of inflation that's generally talked about, there are another couple of types of inflation that are extremely important for property investors but don't get talked about quite so much.
Now, it's easy to assume that these are the same things. Well, assets go up as well, caused by inflation. And it's true, but it's not linked to CPI. So whatever the CPI rate is, the rate of inflation for your goods, that might be going up at 2.7%. But asset price inflation could be going up at a different rate, higher or possibly lower. So assets, we all know what that is. The things like property. Property is an asset. You've got other assets as well. And they will have their own rate of inflation. Sometimes the rates are quite similar. So the amount an asset's going up by will be very similar to the CPI rate. But there's times like at the moment where property's going up, 8% plus, but CPI at the time of recording is only going up by 2.1%. So the cost of your normal goods are going up and roughly at the targeted rate. But if you're not investing in assets, you're actually getting further behind that way because assets currently, like property, are accelerating. And it's not just property. There's many different asset classes at the moment which are really driving up in price. So people see, look, inflation 2.1%. but then don't acknowledge the price of assets and their rapid rate of inflation at the moment. So by not investing in those assets that are really pushing on right now, you are missing out, even if your savings rate is 2.2%, which I don't know any savings account that gives that level. But let's just say that you manage to find the one in the world that's secure that gives you 2.2. You might be feeling smug because you're slightly outperforming inflation. But actually, you shouldn't be so smug because you've got stock market, property, and many other assets going up, and up at a much faster rate. So while you think you might be 0.1 up against inflation, actually, you're about 6% down on everyone else who's investing.
And then there's a third type of inflation as well, which is monetary inflation. And this is actually where the original term inflation came from, although its meaning has changed over the time. And monetary inflation is an increase in the amount of money in circulation. Now, we won't get into this in much detail yet. It becomes more important when we talk about long-term inflation in next week's episode. But it is worth understanding as something that happens, which is that the amount of money in existence changes. It changes as a result of actions of the Bank of England. It changes as a result of the actions of commercial banks, like the ones that you might have an account with. And it matters because the more money there is, the less that money is worth. I know it's weird, it's hard to get your head around, and we will talk about it more in the future. But the amount of money that exists in an economy makes a big difference to prices. And over the last year, the money supply has gone up by about 15%, which is huge. It doesn't normally go up by anything like that amount. So that's why this type of inflation is worth being aware of. And we'll come back to it later because it does become important.
So what causes inflation? Well, there's a lot of factors at play. And that's one of the reasons this is a two-parter. In the short term, inflation is often driven by shifts in supply and demand. And over the long term, it's normally more driven by government policy. And what we're going to do is break it up into two parts. In this episode, we're going to focus more on short-term inflation. And then next week, when you come back, we're going to talk about long-term inflation. And it's critical that you understand the differences between the two. So that's why we're splitting it into two to make this as easy as possible to digest. So let's look at short-term inflation now in 2021, because we have it. But interestingly, it's only been creeping up, and now it's reached a level of 2.1%, as we've said. But it's been a lot lower than that. So it's been moving upwards, and that's why it's started to gain attention, because people are noticing this upward trend. So why is that happening? Well, let's look at it.
Well, we briefly mentioned that over the short term, inflation is driven by shifts in supply and demand. So if you've got the same amount of items being supplied and you've got more people suddenly wanting those items, then the market will adjust so the price of that increases until there's a match between supply and demand. Or you could get price increases via the other mechanism. So the amount being demanded stays the same, but the amount of supply falls, so there's less to go around. Therefore, people need to pay more if they want to get it. Whichever way around it is, whether it's supply or demand, a change in that balance can create the conditions for inflation. And at the moment, in 2021, we're seeing both of those. We're seeing an increase in demand and a reduction in supply. So let's start with the increase in demand. And this is something that you were saying, Rob, but way back, right back at the start of the pandemic, you were saying that this would happen when things open up. And indeed, it is. Things are opening up again and people are going out and wanting to make up for lost time. They've not been able to spend money on all kinds of things for quite a while. They've had a rough year and they want to go out and spend and have a good time. It's also worth remembering that some categories of spending you still can't do. So there is some limited travel coming back, for example, but you can't necessarily go and book holidays in the same way you could before. And there are other categories of spending like that as well. So the spending that people do want to make gets channeled into what you can spend money on. So when we talk about CPI, like I said earlier, that is an average of lots of different types of spending that get measured, but you can have different rates of inflation in different categories. So for example, maybe people can't go on holiday, so they spend money doing up their homes. So you could have the price of construction materials and things like that going up, which is exactly what's happening, in fact. And we'll talk about construction costs in a bit. So demand is increasing because people are being unleashed a little bit. But the other reason, Rob, for the increase in demand is something that you wouldn't necessarily have thought at the start of the pandemic. You'd have thought that it would be devastating in terms of people's finances. And for some people, it certainly has been. But there are also a lot of people who've got more savings, therefore more ability to spend than they did a year ago.
Yeah, it was really a lottery of what type of job you had. Unfortunately, if you worked in the travel and tourism industry or hospitality, then things probably weren't so good for you. But if you had an office job and that business continued to thrive or just survive and carry on as it was, then if suddenly you've lost your commute, the lunches you bought, and other costs as well, but buying more clothes for the office visits, etc., you suddenly start to see how a lot of people in this country have been steadily building up their savings pots. And this is absolutely the case. So it's a typical unfortunate scenario of the haves and have-nots again. And it was just very much down to the luck of the industry you were in. But for all those people in industries that have been reasonably unaffected, and have come out of it the other side and are already sort of back to normal, the people involved in those industries have generally benefited quite well from this. So it's crazy to say, and people don't even like saying these things out loud because there are people who've been really financially hurt by this, but there are a significant number of people who are financially better off. And they are spending that money now because, as Rob said, things are opening back up and they have options, they have choices. And you know what? They want to just cheer themselves up as well. So they want to buy that new item or splash out on that extra extravagant holiday or treat themselves to a new wardrobe. Whatever it might be, it's happening. So as a nation, we're not typically good at saving, but we are quite good at spending, and we're absolutely living up to that at the moment and spending more and more, which is causing inflation. But Rob, we've talked about supply and demand, and we've talked about demand here, but the supply issue has to take place as well. So we've talked about reasons for the short-term demand and where that pressure's coming from. But let's talk about supply now.
Yeah, if supply stayed the same and everything that we just talked about took place, then you'd expect some inflation because you've got more people demanding the same amount of stuff. But we're also at the moment seeing a reduction in supply. So you've actually got more people wanting less stuff than there was before. And there are a few reasons for that. One is to do with the pure logistics of the pandemic. Over the last 20 years, the move to globalization has been absolutely huge. And for so many different goods, like pretty much anything you can imagine now, parts for those goods come from all over the world. You've got global supply chains. And when borders close and transit between those countries becomes more difficult, that is naturally going to affect those supply chains. And it means that people aren't going to be able to get the parts they need. Production is going to slow down, and therefore supply of those goods is reduced. Another input into goods and services is labour. And in the UK, there's been a reduction in the supply of labour as well. And there are various reasons for this. One being fewer overseas workers. Some of that may be Brexit related. Some of it will have been people wanting to go back home to their families when the pandemic broke out and not wanted or been able to come back since. But then there are lots of other smaller, harder to measure kind of reasons why labour supply has decreased as well, such as people just leaving university and deciding to stay in training because it's harder to get openings in the industries that they wanted to be in, or people choosing to go back into training and stay out of the labour market completely because that the career they were in before is suddenly not as viable as it was. So if you've got the same number of jobs to be done, roughly speaking, and you've got fewer people willing to do those jobs, that naturally is going to push up wages because firms need to compete for the people who are in the labour market. That puts up their costs. Those costs end up getting passed on to the consumer and therefore inflation. But also, Rob, something of particular interest to people in property is that input costs into any kind of form of construction have gone up. And it's not just one factor, it's pretty much everything you can think of.
Yeah, timber, concrete, bricks, all more expensive. I was speaking to a builder recently. He was complaining that the skirting boards that he's agreed to put into a home are now more than double the price that they were a few months ago. Absolutely crazy rate of inflation. But we have those extreme pressures on the market right now. And while that may soften and slow down at some point, it has to, it can't carry on at that rate forever, it is already impacting pricing decisions around construction right now. Another development that we've worked on at Property Hub Invest, we were close to launching for our clients there, had to be postponed because it was going to be built with timber frame. So they had to go back into planning to change the construction method because timber has gone up by so much again. So even with short-term inflation, we can see there are multiple factors at play. But with short-term inflation right now, all those multiple factors are pointing in one direction. Because these can go two ways, right? People could decide that they don't want to spend, they're fearful, so they hold back on spending. Or there'll become some weird tax on home improvements. So then there's a reversal on the demand of those materials. Or COVID eases off, borders reopen, access to goods is a lot easier. So then supply issues aren't as intense as they were. But at the moment, you've got multiple factors in play that are pushing up demand. And at the same time, multiple factors at play which is reducing supply. So we've seen that inflation's ticking up, and it's currently at 2.1%. But based on what's happening, and I don't think I'll get any awards for saying this because it seems just common sense based on what we've discussed, that it'll continue to go up and it will go beyond 2.1%.
Well, what if it does, Rob? This sounds terrible. Everything that you want to buy is getting more expensive. Your earnings aren't going as far. People are worse off than they were before. Surely the government will do anything they can to stamp out inflation.
Well, you see, the government actually wants inflation. At least they admit to wanting mild inflation. You could say they've got strong motives for high inflation, which we can get into. But the official target is 2%. And there's a margin around that 2% that inflation can hover at. And the government is perfectly happy with that. In fact, beyond happy, that's the target. That's what they want. Because they believe that it's necessary for a growing economy. They see mild inflation as a good thing. And they fear with great intensity deflation, which is the opposite of inflation. It's a reduction in prices. But the reason they fear it is because they believe everything will exaggerate. So if you believe that the cost of your goods is going to be cheaper next week, then you hold off spending. But then you get to the next week and they've dropped and you think it's going to fall further, then you hold off spending again. And therefore, there's this huge contraction and a snowball of deflation. So they do their very best to stay away from it. And most importantly, and the one that they probably won't admit to, is it helps reduce their debts. The level of debt the UK government and many governments around the world now have is beyond any level ever seen in human history, including superseding the Second World War, which is just astonishing. Now, after the Second World War, the only other time where we saw this huge debt taken on by the world, the way they got out of it was inflation. That was the only way. There was no other way to do it. The debt is too big now. A little bit more in tax ain't going to cut it. I often read people saying, well, tax is coming because they need to pay off the debt. They ain't paying that debt off. That is ludicrous. If you think that tax increases are going to pay the debt off, then you've not looked at the numbers. You can't do it. We'd have to be paying 100% tax. So it's just not going to work. The only way they've got any chance of reducing the debt is through inflation, because the cost of your debt in real terms goes down. So let's look at £1 million worth of debt. Now, as we know, the numbers are much bigger than that. But you've got £1 million. Now, in 10 years' time, inflation has taken in place. And let's just, to keep things simple, say everything's doubled in price because of inflation. So your car is now double. Your wage, your P is now double. It's not really because of inflation and everything else has gone up in double. But anyway, still feels nice. Your food shop's double. Everything's double. But your debt, you've chipped down a little bit. So it's 950,000. So while it may feel like you've paid 50 grand off in 10 years, in reality, you've had a lot more help, because that £1 million really now is half in its value compared to what it was 10 years earlier, because everything else has doubled in price, but your debt has been roughly the same, chipped down slightly. So everything else is double, but your debt now is worth half as much as before. And that's why governments secretly love inflation, because if they allow inflation to run away a bit, then those debts will be diminished, even if the number itself doesn't come down.
So with inflation at 2.1%, the government is perfectly happy. Like Rob said, they target 2% inflation, so it's pretty much bang on. But Rob also said that he believes that inflation will pick up from where it is now. And I completely agree. I don't think that's a controversial view, given all the factors that we've just talked about. So what will the government do if inflation picks up from where it is now? It goes from 2% to 3% to 4%. Well, the answer is likely to be not much. I don't think they're going to do much about it at all. So let's explore a little bit why that is the case. First, though, I said what will the government do? Technically, in the UK, it's the Bank of England's decision. It's a Bank of England that's got the mandate to keep inflation at 2%. Technically, the Bank of England is independent of government. We could have a whole conversation about that. I think it's fair to use the two of them interchangeably. But in the UK, it's the Bank of England. In the US, it's the Federal Reserve. It's a central bank that's responsible for inflation. And the current word out of the Bank of England is that they believe that it's transitory. Transitory is the word. Whenever they talk about inflation at the moment, they seem to believe it's not going to last. Why is that? Because they believe that the factors that we've talked about so far in terms of increased demand and reduced supply are going to resolve. So you can see that argument. These things are all temporary. People will get over making up for lost time. They'll run down their savings a bit. The world will open up and it'll be easier to move goods around. When all these factors resolve, inflation goes away. This, though, is only looking at part of the picture. And in fact, there are longer term structural reasons why inflation is going to stay and may indeed even pick up. But we'll save that for the next episode. The next reason why they're unlikely to take much action is that inflation has been low for a long time. Since around about 2015, inflation has been under 2% for most of the time. And as we know, the government wants inflation. They get the central bank to target 2%, but it's actually undershot that target for a lot of time. So if inflation now starts overshooting that target for a while, well, maybe they'll see that as making up for lost time and they'll be quite happy with that. Indeed, in the US, they've said that explicitly this is what they're doing. This is something that happened quite subtly and hasn't been picked up everywhere, but they had the same 2% target. They've redefined this as an average target. So by saying that 2% is a target on average, it means they don't need to stick to 2% in any given year. They can say it's the average. Therefore, if it's been under for a few years, then you can let it go over for a few years without worrying about it, because on average, you're still at your 2%. Interestingly, they haven't said anywhere over what period of time they're trying to establish this average. So really, at any given point in the time, the inflation number can be absolutely anything, and they can still say that over some undisclosed period, they're still going to hit this 2% on average. And I think that gives you a clue as to how relaxed central banks are about inflation, because when it's below their target, they're doing anything they can to try to get it up. But then when it starts going above the target, they start redefining the target to mean that that's okay. They don't have to do anything about it. And Rob, one of the reasons for them perhaps not wanting to do too much about inflation is because the solution, or the main solution, is that the historic solution to combating inflation would be very unpopular at the moment.
It would be, and that is to raise interest rates. Traditionally, raising interest rates has been a tool, a mechanism to bring down inflation, because suddenly if everyone's cost of debt increases and the cost of acquiring debt increases, then people may be less likely to go ahead with a purchase or an acquisition or whatever else, and this then ripples through the entire economy, and people have less money because their debt is now more expensive to service. It works quite well. And with us at 2.1% and things looking like they're going to push further, should you be worried about interest rates moving up? Because ultimately, if you have a mortgage, if it's not in a fixed period, it'll go up. But even if you have a fixed term mortgage, that fixed term will end at some point. So then your mortgage will go up the time after. So should you be worried? Well, no, not currently. Because the Bank of England have said inflation is coming, but don't expect us to react. They've said not only are they going to not raise interest rates, they're also not going to end their current money printing activities either. Someone always picks up on this. I don't mean physically printing, but the creation of money. So they're going to carry on creating money, and they're going to not raise interest rates. The reason why the printing money part is important is because we've heard already that the increasing of money supply means that you have inflation, both monetary and asset, because people then use that additional money to go and buy more assets. So not only are they not going to put the brakes on with the tool that they've got to slow inflation down, they're actually going to keep speeding ahead with one of the main drivers behind inflation. So yeah, we're quite far away, it seems. And the Bank of England have also said that they expect in the short term inflation to hit 3%. And they're okay with that too, because they believe it's short term. We will see. So there is a way to stop this, but it seems that the world governments have no desire or interest in stopping it. And that's kind of understandable, because you've already heard us talk about the motives that they have to keep inflation going.
So what's the effect of all this then, especially for property investors? Because for most people, day to day, if inflation is evenly distributed, then it's not that big a deal, especially for property investors. Because if you don't have any assets, you don't have any savings, you don't have any debts, so you're just literally having money coming in and money going out each month, then if inflation is relatively evenly distributed between all the different things that you spend on and the money that you've got coming in, then you don't really notice inflation. So if your wages go up by 2% and everything that you buy goes up by 2%, you end up with your money going exactly as far as it did before, and it doesn't make that much difference. It's by the time you start trying to save and invest that inflation becomes a big deal. So for property investors, this short-term inflation has got good news and bad news attached to it. Let's start with the bad news, which is anything that you're doing in terms of refurbs or flips or doing anything hands-on with a property. It's going to be tough at the moment. Your margins are going to be squeezed because materials are costing more, as we've said, and the cost of labour is likely to cost more as well. So if you've got a model that involves buying a property, doing some work into it, increasing the value, and then trying to refinance, then whatever you are budgeting for your refurb, you'll need to be budgeting more. If you're involved in a lengthy project that's going on for a number of years, whatever costings you did back at the start are unlikely to still be realistic. I was talking to someone the other day who's got an outbuilding on their property that they were going to convert into a dwelling. They got a quote for it last year. They got it re-quoted again just now, and the quote has doubled. It's literally doubled because of the materials and because of the labour cost, and probably because the builder's so busy and knows that they can. And so that's made that completely unviable now. So that's the bad news of this inflation, especially because of the nature of the inflation, because so much of it is to do with physical materials. That is pretty painful. However, Rob, there is good news as well in terms of rents.
There is, because wage inflation will kick in as well. It doesn't happen normally at the same time. There's normally a lag effect. So the price of goods go up, and then there's that pressure on wage inflation to follow behind. But once it follows, that means people have more money. And if people have more money, that often means that rents will also increase as well. Because rental inflation is not like asset inflation. It's more closely tied to CPI. Not exact, but closer, because it's more related to the amount of money that people have in their pockets. So that's why you don't see rents going up in big surges, but also crashing in big surges as well. Occasionally it happens, but most of the time it's quite steady because it's more closely linked to wage inflation. So because wage inflation is on the cards, then you should expect to see rents ticking up as well in the not too distant future.
So that's what the inflation that we're seeing now and are likely to continue to see accelerate through the rest of the year means for you as an investor. It means bad news, your projects are going to cost more, but good news, your rents might be going up. But if you're thinking, well, that doesn't sound that dramatic, well, you're right. It's not. The kind of short-term inflation that we're seeing at the moment is important to understand, and the response to that inflation is even more important to understand because it tells you a lot about how governments are feeling about inflation. And all this is something that you've got to understand as a consumer and as someone who's just trying to save. But as an investor, as I've said, inflation becomes exceptionally important, but not short-term inflation. It's inflation over the long term that you really need to get to grips with. We've done a lot of groundwork in this episode that's going to set us up to talk about long-term inflation next week. And I warn you now, there are some absolutely shocking numbers in next week's episode. We've already done the research for this. You're going to be absolutely astonished by some of the things we talk about.
So it's time for Hub Extra, the part of the show where we just want to deliver even more value. We can't help ourselves. We want to give you that little bit more. And of course, this is all backed up by the Hub Extra email that goes out each and every Friday. We try and make it the most valuable email that hits your inbox each and every week. If you'd like that newsletter, then simply join Property Hub. How do you do that? How much does it cost? Well, let's just go on the website and sign up. There is no cost. And then you can access all the courses and so much more, plus get the Hub Extra email. It's a bit of a no-brainer. And Rob, this week's Hub Extra is a bit of a no-brainer as well.
Yes, it is. This is another free service, not from us, but from the Land Registry. We may have mentioned it before years and years and years ago, but I was reminded of it this week, and it's well worth repeating. This is their property alert service that allows you to sign up for alerts if anything changes relating to one of your properties on the Land Registry. Why is that worth doing? Well, because all kinds of things could be happening relating to your property without you necessarily knowing about it. So someone could fraudulently claim to own your property and take out debt against it. You could have restrictions registered against the property. All kinds of fraudulent activity does go on, and you wouldn't necessarily know about it and be able to do something about it until it's too late. With the service, all you have to do is go on and register your properties, and then you're going to get an email alert every time something happens that you might need to know about. So if you take out a mortgage, for example, then you'll be notified and you'll be, okay, that's fine because I know I've taken out a mortgage and that was me. That's okay. But if you get an email when you weren't expecting something, then you'll be able to do something about it and might be able to take action before it's too late. So free to sign up to, only takes a couple of minutes, no reason not to. And you'll find a link to that along with everything else we talk about today in the show notes that go with this episode.
So we're back next week with another episode on inflation. And as Rob's already said, there are some crazy numbers that we're going to run through. You will not want to miss it. So make sure you join us for that. And of course, we'll be back for Ask Rob and Rob on Tuesday. So until then, take care. Have fun. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.